We are continuing in our discussions of Franz Rosenzweig and his approach to halacha. 2 sessions ago, we focused on how Rosenzweig eschews sort of the binary that halacha must be everything or nothing, right? That either halacha is everything and you have to submit to every mitzvah, every halacha, no matter what, or halacha is nothing. It's actually a barrier to Jewish life. We're modern, we move beyond it. You know, when we can connect spiritually and religiously in other ways. Rosenzweig refuses both of those options, and for what he calls the something, not nothing or everything, but something. And then last week we saw this idea of ability that he develops, right? That our ability to do mitzvot is sort of the deciding factor, not our free choice, not because we just want to do them or we like to do them or we find them meaningful or relevant. It's because we can do them. And for Rosenzweig, that ability stems to a certain extent from being drawn to mitzvot and to hearing God's call in them. And as Rosenzweig also emphasized that we saw last time, he places a great significance on the doing, right? That you can't tell what a mitzvah really is until you're in the inside of it. And that's why you got to put yourself in the inside of it as much as you can. And when you do, as he says, right, one hears differently in the doing. You can't necessarily always hear God in the way you want when you're just watching it from the outside, but in the doing of it, one hears differently. That's his Rosenzweig's important point. Today, we're going to sort of bring this section to a close through a very interesting idea Rosenzweig develops. It's part of the letter that we saw to Rudy Hallow, where Rosenzweig says, right, halacha is not everything, nothing, but something. And what we're going to look at today is this idea that Rosenzweig develops, which I titled the shiur, "When will I do all the mitzvot? Not yet." Right? This idea of not yet is very, very significant for Rosenzweig, and we have to unpack what that means. It may be, one could argue, Rosenzweig's greatest innovation, because it's not just, it's primarily, we're going to look at it in relation to mitzvah observance, but for Rosenzweig, it's much bigger than that, and we'll see that by the end of today's shiur. So to pick up, this is the letter to Rudy Hallow. We've seen pieces of this already. This is towards the end of the letter. And Rosenzweig, in the passing, addresses this question about feeling pressure to take on more and more mitzvot, and how he relates to that, to this pressure of the need to take on more and more mitzvot. So he's writing to Rudy Hallow, his good friend, who's a little younger than him. Rudy Hallow is constantly pressuring Rosenzweig on these questions of religious observance, as we saw. And one of the questions that Hallow brings up is sort of, who does Rosenzweig think his audience is in all of his work, particularly his translation work? After the Star of Redemption, after he becomes the head of the Lehr House, Rosenzweig engages in these massive translation projects, translating Yehuda Levi's poems. He ultimately does a translation of the Bible into German with Martin Buber, which becomes very significant. Who does Rosenzweig see as the audience? Who are his students? That's maybe the best way to describe the question. And basically, Rosenzweig says as follows: for whom do I translate? So who's my audience when I'm here to teach Torah and the Star of Redemption, all of this? For those who do not know Hebrew, and incidentally, for those that know Hebrew, but because of existing translations which intentionally shade the prayers with an apologetic hue. He says, I have 2 audiences in mind. One are those who don't know Hebrew at all. That's the obvious audience. If you're translating presumably because people don't know the native language. So you're translating it so those people can access it. Right? So on the one hand, he's translating into German so the German Jews who don't know Hebrew can access these significant and important religious texts. But Rosenzweig adds something here, which is significant, that he's not just translating for the German Jews who don't know Hebrew. He's also translating for the German Jews who know Hebrew, but because of the existing translations, which are, as he says here, shaded with an apologetic hue, meaning too much of the translation that exists in Rosenzweig's time makes too many concessions to the modern condition. And what he's concerned about is the fact that German Jews miss the opportunity to experience something authentic about the text that a different kind of translation can pick up than the one that's often used. Modern translations, and we'll see this again in a couple of weeks, are often about trying to bring the text as close as possible to the reader. That's a problem when it comes to the Torah, because the Torah is about bringing us closer to the Torah, about bringing us closer to God, right? If you bring the Torah all the way to us, right, at a certain point it stops being Torah anymore. So Rosenzweig's attempt here with translation is to bring people back to something more authentic within Torah. And as part of the conversation with Hallow, he says, well, wait a second, Hallow, do you think I'm translating for my Christian friends? Right? He kind of feels like Hallow is being a little judgmental, that maybe Rosenzweig is doing this project to make Judaism look good to his Christian friends. And Rosenzweig has an ongoing dialogue with his Christian friends about Judaism. But the implication there is that Rosenzweig is engaged in apologetics, right? How to translate Judaism to a German Christian audience so that it's palatable to them, that it makes Judaism respectable. And Rosenzweig doesn't like this idea, because if there's one thing Rosenzweig is not trying to do, it's apologetics. Because again, apologetics is about bringing the text to the reader rather than bringing the reader to the text. He says, God forbid, seriously, like that I'm just doing apologetics here. Of course, counted amongst those that do not know Hebrew is Ehrenberg and Rosenstock. These are his two Jewish friends who converted to Christianity. We've seen them before. So they don't know Hebrew, right? So at a certain level, these translations I'm doing, he's saying, are for them. But in my translation work, I thought only of myself. But at the end of the day, the audience that Rosenzweig has in mind is himself, right? He's the kind of person that he's writing for, about myself, how prayer sounds to me, and how it sounds when I utter it, right? What do the words of prayer mean to Rosenzweig when he recites them? How do they sound in his ear when he says them out loud, right? That there's something deeper and more authentic that he's trying to get at. He says, I did not change a thing for the consideration of Christians. If you thought I am reinterpreting Judaism to make it something that Christians can hear and understand, to make it more Christian in a certain way, he says, absolutely not. And we saw last time how Rosenzweig distinguishes between what he sees as approaches or ways of thinking that are more Jewish and those that are more Christian. That distinction matters for him. He sees both Christians and Jews as having a role in the unfolding redemption of the world, but they are different roles. And that difference is really, really important for him. And he goes on, this is all introduction. It's the last part I really want to focus on. Do you think my Christian friends would treat me negatively at all if I started to wear tefillin or fast together with the community of Frankfurt for all their fasts? So what he's saying to Hallow is, if your concern was that I have to make Judaism palatable for my Christian friends, because if I don't, they won't be friends with me anymore, that's not the case at all, right? He says, today I could start putting on tefillin. I could start fasting all the fasts, right? The minor fasts he's presumably referring to, with all the Orthodox Jews in Frankfurt where he lives, and my Christian friends they'd still be my friends, right? I'm not preventing myself from taking on religious observance because I'm worried that I'm going to lose their friendship. On the contrary, a long time before you, Rudy, pressed me to take on all these mitzvot, they already pressed me, and I responded to them with the same calm, my not yet, just as I responded to you. And what Rosenzweig seems to be referring to here is in the early days after his decision to remain Jewish. We saw this actually in the letter from Ehrenberg, right? The Christian friends were saying, well, if you're going to stay Jewish, you better really mean it. You better really commit to it, right? So Rosenzweig already sort of felt a pressure about his Jewish religious observance from his Christian friends. And even back then, he was not willing just to jump into mitzvot because his Christian friends thought that if he wants to be a Jew, that's what he should do. Right? If there's one thing Rosenzweig recognizes, is that our path of spiritual growth, of authentic religiosity, of Frumkeit, can't be because other people are pressuring us to do it. It's got to be a path that we ultimately walk on our own. And he notes, to them, and also to Hallow, what was his response when they pressured him about, you got to do more, you got to be a more serious Jew, you got to take on mitzvot? Rosenzweig answers them with these two very fateful words, not yet, right? Calmly, he says it to them, not yet. You remember on January 6, 1920, before noon at the train station, on that day, January 6, 1920, some hours afterwards, my not yet transformed into now. So this last part is a little bit cryptic, but we have to understand what's going on in this reference that he's saying to Hallow. Again, Christian friends Rosenzweig feels like they're pressuring him to be Jewish. Hallow is pressuring him to, again, be more religious, be more Jewish, not because Hallow's not more firm than Rosenzweig, far from it. But in some ways, it would just be so much easier for Hallow if Rosenzweig was more firm, because then Hallow might feel like he could do it. Look, my teacher, my role model, he's able to take this on, then I can as well. Or maybe more cynically, I want Rosenzweig to take it all on so I can be different from him. Like I can then let him be the firm one so I don't feel like I have to be. But this reference here to January 6, 1920, is the date of Rosenzweig's wedding. Rosenzweig's wedding to his wife, Edith Hahn. And what he's describing here is a moment that we don't have much more of a record about, but seemingly on the day of his wedding, him and Hallow were at the train station together, not that long beforehand. It seems that Hallow is once again pressuring him about religious observance, though we don't know exactly what it's about. And at the time, Rosenzweig said, not yet, but some hours later that same day, presumably after the marriage, after the wedding, Rosenzweig says has not yet turned into a now. And the way this is typically understood is that it's a reference specifically to the mitzvah of tefillin. That for years up until now, Rosenzweig has not put on tefillin. It was something that he didn't feel he had the ability to do. It was something that was perpetually not yet. But after his wedding, the mitzvah of tefillin goes from being something that is not yet for him to now. He finally feels that he is able to put them on. Now, we're going to have to unpack again, what does not yet mean, what's going on here, but I want to just point out some very basic things, particularly as it relates to the mitzvah of tefillin, because the mitzvah of tefillin becomes, I would say, a very important one for Rosenzweig, right? The mitzvah of tefillin, right, which is maybe one of the more strange mitzvot that we do, right? We're wrapping our bodies with these leather straps and these boxes. It's a very strange thing. There's nothing more strange than being in an airport and putting on tefillin in a place where you're pretty sure they have no idea like what a Jew is, right? When you do that, that's happened to me more than once, right? Like it's something about it that feels very strange, very unusual. And you can understand why a Baal Tshuva might not be rushing to put on tefillin as their first major mitzvah, because there is something unusual about it if you've never really done it before. But tefillin, right? We literally bind the tefillin upon our bodies. It is symbolically understood as ultimately binding ourselves to God, right? Tefillin are a sign of the brit, of the covenant that the Jews have with God. And then we put on tefillin, it's a way of affirming that covenant. And what's fascinating, of course, is that if the tefillin is all about affirming the covenant, right, that covenant is then ultimately reflected in the act of marriage, right? Marriage is a covenant, right? Covenant between a husband and a wife. And what's fascinating is when you put on your tefillin, you wrap it around your arm 7 times, you put your tefillin shel rosh on, and then you finish wrapping it around your hand. And when you wrap it around your hand, you traditionally say 2 verses, particularly when you wrap it around your finger. You say these verses from Hosea, the prophet Hosea, Ve'erastich li li'olam, ve'erastich li b'tzedek u'b'mishpat, u'v'chesed u'b'rachamim, ve'erastich li be'emunah, ve'yadata et Hashem. So what do these verses mean? When you're literally wrapping the tefillin around your finger, you're saying, I will betroth you forever. I will betroth you with righteousness and justice and with goodness and mercy. And I will betroth you with faithfulness. Then you shall be devoted to the Lord. And these are verses, again, the prophet is speaking in God's voice to the Jewish people. But when we recite these verses as we wrap the tefillin, we are affirming our marital covenant, so to speak, with God, right? This connection of love that binds us to God and God to us. And the Gemara actually has this sort of fantastical idea that just as the Jewish people put on tefillin, God also puts on tefillin. There's this mutuality, right? Each one is sort of binding themselves to this covenant. So for Rosenzweig, you can imagine, right? The day of his marriage is a day of covenants, right? The tefillin is this act of covenant. And it's only when he reaches the point of his marriage does the mitzvah go from being not yet to now. He finally has the ability to do it. It becomes a real moment of mitzvah for him, and presumably a pretty significant and profound moment. And in one other piece, Rosenzweig reflects on the mitzvah of tefillin, and he notes that there's something about the mitzvah of tefillin that is paradigmatic for the way we think about all mitzvot. And this is from it's a collection of like notes that Rosenzweig wrote, I think a couple of years earlier before this. And he has a very interesting reflection on the mitzvah of tefillin. He says the entirety of a Jew's relationship to halacha is embedded in the prayer recited before putting on tefillin, right? There's a bracha, it's not even a bracha, it's really a kavanah that you can say before you put on tefillin. Not everybody even says it, but it's in the Siddur. And Rosenzweig sees great theological significance in this kavanah, this saying that would be recited before putting on tefillin. It is, may it be your will that this mitzvah of putting on tefillin should be considered as if I have fulfilled the 613 mitzvot in all their details, rules, and intentions that are tied to it. Right, so the bracha essentially means in this act of doing this one mitzvah of tefillin, all the other 613 mitzvot are fundamentally connected to it. And this saying is actually a Kabbalistic idea, but we can see for a moment why it's so important for Rosenzweig, because when halacha becomes truly a mitzvah, right, it's a moment in which we find ourselves hearing God's commanding voice, and we find ourselves bound to God. In that moment of mitzvah, in any mitzvah, applies to all mitzvot, right? So the moment of mitzvah in tefillin is something that is reflected, that idea of mitzvah in all mitzvot, and vice versa. It's just that tefillin captures this in a unique way with this saying, that this mitzvah somehow contains all the mitzvot. It does if it is a real mitzvah in the way that Rosenzweig understands it. He says in one mitzvah, everything is bound. They are fulfilled in it and through it, all the mitzvot. In truth, every mitzvah is only a symbol of accepting the yoke of heaven. Kabbalat o mitzvot, right? It comes through in every mitzvah. Every halacha, every ritual has that chance to be the mitzvah in the way that Rosenzweig understands it. This acceptance does not occur all at once, rather in a continuous manner in every mitzvah. Because of this, it is said that there are no greater or lesser mitzvot. All of them are a symbol identical to the system as a whole. Right, every halacha can become a mitzvah, right, which means everything is sort of in this equivalent relationship with each other when it comes to halacha and mitzvah, right? Anything can become the mitzvah. When it becomes a real mitzvah, right, everything is bound up in it, because that's the moment when you hear God's call of love me, right? Right? That's the heart of the covenant. When a mitzvah really becomes a mitzvah, that is a profound covenantal moment. That is the moment when you recognize the way you're just bound to God and you can't escape it. So again, what Rosenzweig is saying here, on his wedding day, that not yet became now. And what he seems to be attesting to is that was that moment that the tefillin became a true mitzvah for him. One that isn't just about the individual mitzvah of tefillin, but a moment or an act or a mitzvah that reverberates ultimately through all the mitzvot, because that's the mitzvot where you feel that you hear God's call. The challenge, however, as Rosenzweig articulated, is that this is not meant to be a one-time moment. It's not just, this one moment, I have a magical moment. We know Rosenzweig doesn't like that, right? But when you have that moment of mitzvah, right, with the tefillin, there's something fundamentally enduring about that, just like it is with any mitzvah. When you have a real mitzvah, right, when you reach that moment, there's something about it that just stays. There's no going back from it. Again, Rosenzweig does not think we need this transformation. We don't need to have this conversion experience. Jews aren't born again. That's what Christians experience. A Jew doesn't have a moment of mitzvah that's sort of some kind of spiritual transformation. Ultimately, we aspire to feel that sense of being bound, of being commanded in all 613 mitzvot. Even as we recognize that particular moment when we feel it for all the mitzvot may very well be still not yet. And what I want to focus on today is this idea of not yet. What happens when we haven't had this moment that Rosenzweig is hoping for, aspiring to, believes is possible, right? Where do we go? How do we understand it? What kind of answer is not yet when God is telling you got to do something? And you could think that the answer of not yet is in some ways like a cop-out, right? Is this even a Jewish answer? When God speaks to Abraham and he tells Abraham to take his son, his beloved son, Yitzchak, and sacrifice him on Har Moriah, Abraham does not say to God, well, wait a second, God, or I don't know about this. Can we hold off while I try to figure this all out? Right. Abraham, in that moment when God calls out to him, answers, Hineni. Here I am. Yes, God, I will do what you want. So again, we have to ask ourselves, what is this sort of strange answer that Rosenzweig is suggesting that we can offer, this answer of not yet? Now, one way to think about not yet as an answer to God is in a practical sense. And you can actually find this in halacha today. Rav Asher Weiss, who's a noted Israeli posek, has a tshuva where he was asked about a young man with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And the problem this young man has is because of his OCD, he's not able to say the words of the Shema properly, not just the verse of the Shema, but all three paragraphs of the Shema. And because of that, he's not able to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema. Basically, what happens with Shema is you don't have to say it perfectly, but you have to say it more precisely than most other things. And with this young man, he can't say it right. And because he can't say it right, he keeps saying it over and over again. And what happens is the Shema becomes this trigger for his OCD, and it becomes like a spiral for him, right? He obsesses about it, and it causes him a tremendous amount of suffering because he keeps trying to say it, and he keeps not being able to say it properly, and he keeps repeating it over and over and over again. And Rav Asher Weiss is told that the doctors are concerned about this, what should be the approach here. So Rabbi Weiss offers various answers, but one of them is not too far removed from Rosenzweig's answer of not yet. And what Rav Weiss says is that if stopping saying the tefillot or Kriyat Shema will give the young man time to recover from his OCD, so that at some point in the future he can say them properly, then Rav Weiss says this would be an appropriate reason for him to stop saying Kriyat Shema and the paragraphs that go along with it. And in effect, what Rav Asher Weiss is saying, like Rosenzweig, is that the young man doesn't have the ability to recite, to fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema right now. And even though this is a mitzvah d'oraisa, it's a biblical mitzvah, it's okay for him to stop saying it. And why is this? Because the young man isn't rejecting the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, and I think this is very important. He's not saying, I don't want to recite Kriyat Shema, I don't believe in Kriyat Shema. None of that's going on here. We can't just stop doing the mitzvah because we don't like it. But in this case, what the young man is saying effectively is not yet. I'm not yet able to do the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. I need time to work on it, to give himself a break so he can recover. But when he will be able to do so, he will. And I think this makes sense to us, right? One will find even a similar approach regarding Balei Tshuva in the Orthodox world. If a person who's not religious suddenly decides they want to become frum and they want to keep halacha and they want to do all the mitzvot, they are not typically told by the rabbi to jump into everything all at once, because we know that'd be impossible, right? What they're told to do is slowly take on mitzvot one at a time until they get there. And this often sounds very similar to Rosenzweig's idea of not yet. Again, it's sort of a practical solution to an impossible problem, right? You can't do it all at once, or doing it right now is dangerous or problematic. So we know you're not trying to get out of it forever. So we can sort of say, well, it'll be not yet, right? Until you can get there. And I think, again, the practical approach to this makes sense. It's about a recognition about what's possible and what's impossible. And Judaism, as we know, tends to be a rather sober religion. We want to focus on what can be done and not on some fantasy we might hope for, but is ultimately disconnected from life. So that's one way to think about Rosenzweig's not yet. It's sort of a practical answer to a question that doesn't have an easy or obvious answer. And that we're willing to be patient, right? That would be the idea. Now, you could look at not yet this way, but I think Rosenzweig's idea of not yet has a deeper meaning to it, a deeper theological meaning. And that's really where I want to focus on today, because sometimes when Rosenzweig's not yet gets taught, it gets taught in the practical sense, right? I'm a Baal Tshuva, I can't do it all, I'm working on it, I'm just not there yet, right? But I think Rosenzweig is saying something much, much deeper, because Rosenzweig is always saying something much, much deeper at the end of the day. But to understand what he's saying, we have to turn to a Talmudic story, a story you probably know, and it's a story about conversion. It's part of a set of stories of Hillel and Shammai, right? Famous Talmudic rabbis, each one the head of their own school. And it's a series of stories in which potential converts come to Shammai and to Hillel hoping to convert, and they don't have maybe the simplest experience. They go to Shammai, Shammai rejects them. They go to Hillel, Hillel accepts them. Now, and again, if you're familiar with the Talmud at all, Hillel and Shammai have very different personalities and orientations to halacha and mitzvot, and it comes through clearly in these stories. We're going to look at just one of them that I think really gets at Rosenzweig's idea of not yet. Again, you're probably familiar with it, but we're going to take a closer sort of look, deconstructing exactly what's going on here, because like most rabbinic texts or even biblical stories that we're familiar with, we know them on the surface, and we may even sort of know them by heart, but that often means we don't really know them at all. And when you look closely at this Gemara, you see some very, very interesting things happening. So the Gemara opens as follows, that once a certain non-Jew came before Shammai and said to him, make me a convert on condition that you teach me all of the Torah on one foot. Literally, teach me all the Torah while I'm standing on one foot. And what does Shammai do? We know this. Shammai chases him away with the builder's ruler that was in his hand. Shammai was holding on to some kind of measuring stick, and he literally chases this potential convert out with it. Not looking so favorable on the potential convert's request. That same convert, Hillel, he comes before Hillel, and what does Hillel do? A guy array. Hillel converts him. Marlo, but again, we're sort of struck here. Why is Hillel converting him? The convert made this ridiculous condition. You got to teach me Torah on one foot. What does Hillel say? Arlo, da'alecha sani lechavrecha lo ta'avid. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow or to your neighbor. Zohi kola Torah kula. This is the entirety of Torah. Ve'idach, and the rest of the Torah, perushahu. It's an interpretation, presumably an interpretation of this idea. Zil gamor. Go and study. Go and learn the rest of Torah. So again, this is the very simple narrative, only a couple of lines. But as I said, when you look closely, there's some very interesting things going on here. So just to redo it, right? The potential convert comes to Shammai, and he wants to convert. But he wants to convert on his terms, right? He's basically placing a condition before Shammai. I'll convert, but on my condition that you teach me all the Torah on one foot. Now, what exactly does this request mean? Why is this, non-Jew demanding or asking that he be taught the entirety of the Torah on one foot? So, at the very least, what it seems to be conveying, this potential convert, is that even though he knows there's a lot of Torah and there's a lot of mitzvot, he wants it all to be boiled down for him, right? He wants it to sort of be brought down to its essence. And why does he want this? First, it seems to imply a dismissive attitude on his part towards the many, many mitzvot and halachot of Jewish life, right? He's sort of saying like, yeah, I know you got all these rules, but just give me the ikar, give me the essence. That's what I really need to know. I don't have to worry so much about all those details. Just tell me what matters most. And second, when the non-Jew says, teach it to me as I stand on one foot, that expression, teaching me while I stand on one foot, it's not necessarily the most respectful expression, right? There's other ways to sort of maybe get at what's give me the essence, right? He's sort of saying it like, just give it to me and give it to me quickly. Based on all this, you can understand why Shammai reacted the way he did. He doesn't think the convert's sincere. And there's almost like a sense like the convert's like making a joke out of this, right? Teach me it all on one foot, as if somehow that could ever be sufficient. However, when that same potential convert goes to Hillel, Hillel accepts him. Unlike Shammai, Hillel seems to convert him. And he appears to even do something more radical, right? He appears to teach him all of Torah on one foot. When he says to him, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow, to your neighbor. That's the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. So again, we have to understand what is Hillel doing here, right? How could the Torah be reduced to one sort of principle that seems to be like a betrayal of what the Torah is all about, and why this principle, and what's the meaning of this? And if you notice here too, I think this is interesting. He doesn't just say, okay, there's one mitzvah and that's the end of the story. He also says, there's a lot more. Go and learn, right? So again, the complexity of this statement it tells us there's not just like a simple point that Hillel is doing here. So we have to first ask, why does Hillel even try to teach this convert Torah on one foot? Why doesn't he respond assuming like Shammai? This is a cynical question. So perhaps he recognizes that for the convert, there are so many halachot and there are so many mitzvot And the convert wants it distilled down for him because he just doesn't know how he can enter into the covenant without understanding the basic essence, right? Again, I'm not even sure how converts do this, right? There's so many rules, so many halachot, so many mitzvot, but like at a certain point, it's like fair for the convert to say, okay, Rabbi, I get there's all of this, and I know I need to learn it, but like just tell it to me straight. What's going on here? What does it mean to be a Jew? And we can understand why somebody might make that kind of request. Right? I'll give an example. The college student said they wanted to be a doctor, and they were interested in it. So they wanted to learn more about it, and so they went to an experienced doctor. Right? It's a fair question for the college student to ask him. Doctor, can you distill it all down to me on one foot? What does it mean to be a doctor? Right? Just give it to me straight. What does it mean to be a doctor? And if you ask the question in this way, you can actually, I think, learn a tremendous amount and learn something very, very important. But I remember when I was in yeshiva, towards the end of it, I would ask like experienced shul rabbis, what does it mean to be a shul rabbi? Just give it to me straight. What's the essence? What's the ikar of being a shul rabbi? Tell it to me on one foot. And the answers I got were actually very enlightening, because there's a truth that you can discover when you're distilling something very complex, very detailed, into something very simple. But obviously, when you do that, there's also something lost as well. So that's I think the more charitable reading of the convert, why Hillel would be willing to sort of entertain this question in the first place. The second question we have to ask is, what is even meant by Hillel's statements? Again, that which is hateful to your neighbor, to yourself, don't do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary, go study. Right? Because that line gets thrown around in a very simplistic way. But again, when we look at it, there's all these different parts to it. They don't all seem to necessarily fit together. So first off, how is it the Torah can be boiled down to that which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor? Because if that's the case, why do we need all these mitzvot? Right? You know who else said the most important mitzvah was to love the neighbor and that's it? Right? That was Jesus, right? Jesus, in one of his famous sayings, basically makes this clear, right? The biggest mitzvah is love the neighbor as yourself. Or maybe the only mitzvah is love the neighbor as yourself. Now, I will point out that Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara also says, "V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, ze klal gadol shebetorah," right? The loving your neighbor as yourself is the most important principle, or the most important mitzvah in the entire Torah. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, right? If this is all that matters, what about all these other mitzvot? What about kashrus? What about Shabbos? Like, what am I doing here? If it all boils down to what we might say is simply ethics. Again, with Hillel's formulation, again, we can ask ourselves, where is all this? With all these mitzvot that would seemingly be dismissed if this is what Torah is all about. So what's interesting is that Rashi, in his commentary here, offers a very interesting and subtle interpretation of Hillel, which, as far as I'm concerned, is shot, because there's no world I can imagine where Hillel assumes that the main mitzvah, being a Jew, doesn't have anything to do with God. But like, I can't imagine that's the world that's the way that Hillel conceives of Torah. And as we'll see here, for Rashi, that's clearly as well. But again, the way that Rashi understands this, I think, is very subtle and very interesting. So Rashi explains that when Hillel refers to the neighbor, right, that which is hateful to you, don't do to the neighbor, he doesn't just mean your flesh and blood neighbor. That the neighbor being referenced here, at least in part, is God. And how do we know this? And Rashi says it here. Rashi cites a verse from Mishlei, from Proverbs, in which Re'echa is a reference to God. Right? It says, Re'acha v're'a avicha al ta'azov. Right? The friend or the neighbor or the fellow of your father, you shouldn't abandon. And Rashi points out, this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? That God has had this connection with our ancestors, with our forefathers. He is the friend of our forefathers, so to speak, right? Abraham's Re'ah, most prominently, right? That's God. And therefore, al ta'avor al divarav, so again, this is a bit of a radical reinterpretation here, or maybe not, but what Rosenzweig is saying is, do not transgress God's words, just as it would be hateful for you if your friend was to transgress your words. So what Rashi is saying is, if God is your friend and you don't want you shouldn't be doing things to your friend that is hateful to you, well, you wouldn't want your friend not to listen to you. And if God is your friend, then you should listen to God. Right? What basically Hillel is reading into this is that to be a Jew, this responsibility to have this responsibility to the neighbor, to our fellow, applies equally to God as much as it does to our human neighbor. And again, what Rashi is pointing out here is a fundamental truth of the Torah. To be a Jew is to be in a relationship with God just as much as being in a relationship with one's fellow Jews. That's what it means to be in a covenant with God, to be in a brit, as the Jewish people are collectively with God. We are bound to God, and God is bound to us, right? As I said, that's what the act of tefillin is about. It's almost physically binding ourselves, betrothing ourselves to God. That's what marriage is. You are binding yourself to the other person. And once you have a covenant, once you have a brit, that always comes with responsibilities between both sides. That's true in every covenantal relationship, particularly the marital one, which is the model of what Jewish life is all about. For example, if we have a mitzvah to love the neighbor, it certainly applies to the neighbor who lives next door to me, but it also applies to my wife, the one who lives with me. And that's Rashi's point. To be a Jew means to be in a relationship with God, right? To be in that brit, that marital covenant with God. We can't deny it and we can't escape it. God is a close, intimate relationship for us. Just as we wouldn't want our wife to ignore what we have to say, so too, we shouldn't do that to our wives. And the same parallel applies to God here. Just as we wouldn't want God to ignore our words, so too, we shouldn't do the same to God's words. That's why we should do the mitzvot. So when Rashi is, again, pointing out here is that when Hillel says that which is hateful to you, don't do to your friend, it's not just reducing Torah to ethics, right? It is actually always keeping in mind God and the neighbor, because that's what our re'echa is. To be a Jew, your re'echa is God, and your re'echa is your neighbor, and you are bound to God, and ultimately bound to your neighbor as well. Rashi's interpretation doesn't negate the ethical dimension. And again, he actually goes on here in the second part of Rashi, where it says, in other language, you shouldn't do things that you find hateful to your actual friend. And this refers to theft, stealing, adultery, and the majority of mitzvot. So there's like a dual dimension here. What is the God responsibility? Don't do to God what you would find hateful, and then don't do to your actual neighbor what you would find hateful. Both of those meanings, Rashi is saying, are present here in this statement. Now, we don't have time to go into it fully, but for Rosenzweig, the fact that our relationship to God is ultimately directly tied or parallel to our relationship to our fellow human beings is very, very important. For Rosenzweig, it's the very fact that we experience God's love, which opens up to the true possibility of loving the neighbor, right? For Rosenzweig, revelation is God's love for us, and then redemption is God's love, our love for the neighbor, right? That those two are always fundamentally linked. So this is I don't know if Rosenzweig knew this particular interpretation of Rashi, but if he didn't, again, Rosenzweig grasped something very, very fundamental to what it means to be a Jew, is that these dimensions are always fundamentally linked. Now, we have to go on to understand the next part of Hillel's statement, right, where he says, while the rest is commentary, go and learn it. So what does he mean by this? Well, the rest of the Torah is commentary, but you have to go learn it. Now, in a sense, Hillel is actually contradicting the first part of his statement. If the Torah can be taught on one foot, then why does one have to learn the rest of it, right? In a certain sense, he's telling the convert, I'll give you your answer, but it's not going to be the answer that you really want. Because at the end of the day, Torah cannot be reduced to a teaching on one foot. That's what Hillel is saying. I know he says this is the entire Torah, but if it was the entire Torah, you wouldn't have to learn the rest of it, right? That would be the end of the story. The fact you have to learn the rest of it means there's more to Torah. There's more Torah that is part of this that you have to understand. So I think what Hillel is getting at here is a fundamental truth of what it means to be a Jew. And we see this with converts. And it goes back to Rosenzweig's whole point about that our relationship to taking on all the mitzvot is not yet. Because no matter how much learning a convert has before they convert, there's no way for them to learn the entirety of Torah beforehand. And this is actually like a real question that a rabbi has to ask themselves, like, how religious, how knowledgeable does the convert have to be before you can say they're ready to convert? Because there's no rules, there's no hard rules. And we'll see in a moment that the threshold, the bar might be pretty low. Here, Hillel basically made the bar as low as possible. But clearly a convert doesn't have to know everything. And elsewhere in the Talmud, right, there's an expectation that the convert may not have to know much at all. I won't read this text here, or at least not fully, but it basically describes in Masechet Yevamot what you're supposed to do when somebody comes to you and you're a rabbi and they want to convert, right? What's the sort of process of conversion? And the way the Talmud describes it is that your rabbi is supposed to ask the potential convert, Ma'ita Shabbat L'Gayer, right? What occurred to you that you want to convert? Don't you know that being a Jew right now is terrible, right? The non-Jews are out to get us, they're out to kill us. This is not an easy thing to be, right? Why would you want this? And if the potential convert says, right? If he says, yes, I know how terrible it is to be a Jew, but I still want to be a Jew, right? You should accept him. And then it goes on. It says, you let him know about some of the small mitzvot and some of the serious mitzvot. Right? You tell him about some specific mitzvot, agricultural tzedakah laws. Now, again, what's very clear in this Talmudic text is you are not teaching them all the mitzvot before they convert. They're learning something, not everything and not nothing. And that seems to be, very significant. And the reason, again, that this is at least so interesting to me, and I think such a parallel for Rosenzweig gets it, is what this means is if the convert doesn't know everything when they become a Jew, that when they become a Jew, they're not taking on all the mitzvot, right? They just can't, right? There's always going to be mitzvot that they haven't yet learned and they are not yet ultimately able to do, right? So that's significant. If you think halacha is always about doing it all or not, right? There's no way a convert can do it all when they convert. I think, unfortunately, today in the Orthodox community, right, there's this attempt to keep making the bar for conversion higher and higher and higher and higher until basically the convert has to be like a tzaddik, like doing everything perfectly, right? Because in the Orthodox conception, which is about everything, which is in some ways a distortion, but it can't tolerate the idea that a convert may come in and not do everything, right? How could they come in and not do all the mitzvot, right? To be a frum Jew, you got to do all the mitzvot, right? There's something that they can't tolerate about conversion in the Talmudic sense, or certainly in the way that Hillel expressed it. And this comes up not even just with conversion, but with really all aspects of being a Jew. My oldest son turned bar mitzvah about almost 2 years ago, and as my son was approaching his 13th birthday, it started to hit me that there's a lot of mitzvot he doesn't quite know, and a lot of halacha maybe he doesn't quite yet do fully. But once he hits 13, he's fully responsible. That's the halacha. He's an adult, he's chayav, he's fully responsible. But that's kind of insane. My 13-year-old son, God bless him, does a lot of good things well, but he's 13, he's now 14, right? They can't do it all at that age. That would be impossible. So when a child becomes bar mitzvah, right, there's always going to be aspects of halacha or mitzvot that are not yet, which means it's true not just for the convert, it's true for all of us, right? Even the firmest, most knowledgeable 13-year-old does not know everything and can't do everything. There's always a certain dimension of the mitzvot that are ultimately going to be not yet. So here's the thing: how do we then understand what Rosenzweig is getting at here? So after all this, you might think Rosenzweig's approach of not yet is kind of obvious, right? For the convert, it's not yet, right? For the bar mitzvah boy, it's not yet. But here I want to focus on is where it's the idea of not yet isn't so obvious. With the convert, in the example of my son when he turned bar mitzvah, really any of us, what happens? What happens when they encounter something in Torah or mitzvot that they find that they are not only unable to do right now, but they don't really want to do it at all. They don't really want to do it at all ever. What happens when we find mitzvot or halachot that are contrary to our understanding of right and wrong? And what happens when we encounter those mitzvot and we don't want to say not yet, someday I'll get there, but rather we want to say no. We want to say, God, I ain't ever going to do that. And I'll give you the following example just from my own life. Right? I think I mentioned earlier that, I grew up in a very traditional home. We mostly kept Shabbos and we mostly kept kashrut, but not completely, not in the Orthodox sense. And there was a real period of my life where during college and afterwards, where I started taking on mitzvot more seriously, more carefully. And a lot of the mitzvot were things that I knew that I wanted to do, things I always knew I was supposed to do, but just hadn't done fully, right? And those weren't necessarily easy to jump into, but I knew where I was going, and I wanted to ultimately get there. And I could easily say to myself in that process, okay, I'm not there yet with davening 3 times a day, or I'm not there yet with benching after every meal, or I'm not there yet, take your pick, but I know I can get there. I will get there. But at a certain point, I realized that may not be true for all the mitzvot, for everything. At a certain point, I remember learning about the mitzvah of Michiat Amalek. Right? There's a mitzvah in the Torah that says you got to kill all of Amalek. Everyone, even the Amaleki baby, right, has to get killed. And I think before, I really learned this, I had thought that the mitzvah of killing Amalek was something just from the past, right? Something that Bnei Yisrael had to do when they left Egypt, or during the first base of Mikdash, but it just didn't apply. It just wasn't something that was potentially, relevant anymore. I didn't realize that it is technically a mitzvah that theoretically somebody might actually have to do today, right? The halacha really is, if you know someone's Amalek and they're in front of you, you have to kill them. It's a mitzvah. You're commanded, you're obligated to kill them. Doesn't matter what they've done, doesn't matter if they appear innocent, doesn't matter if they're a child or a baby, you have a mitzvah to kill them. And again, without studying all the details of that mitzvah, I'm presenting it in a very strong way, but that reading is certainly potentially there. And when I remember learning about it, as I was becoming more religious, I just said, there's no way I could ever say yes to this. This is just fundamentally immoral. I'm not going to kill in the name of God. Certainly not kill somebody who might, who's innocent. And so for me, I was like, no, that's a no. That's a no, God. I'm sorry. And in truth, for many Jews today, even modern Orthodox Jews, the answer of saying no to mitzvot or certain mitzvot is an acceptable answer. Yeah, God and Torah makes demands of us, but if we come across something that's immoral or simply doesn't make sense, just seems like I could never do that, we feel we have every right to say no to God on those mitzvot. And of course, we know what those on the other end of the religious spectrum think, whether it's in the Haredi world or even certain segments of the modern Orthodox world, right? They think no matter what the mitzvah is, you got to say yes, right? No matter what one feels, one's got to submit themselves to the will of God, and that's the end of the story. No is never an acceptable answer. Remember, I gave before the example of Abraham, right? The only example of acceptable answer is yes, hineni. Yes, God, I'm here to do it. I'm here to kill that Amaleki baby. However, for Rosenzweig, and again, this is where we see his brilliance very clearly, as we know, halacha can't be everything or nothing. Those can't be the only two options of yes or no, right? There's got to be something more at stake here. And not yet for Rosenzweig is a fundamentally different kind of answer. It's one that is neither no or yes. And I wanted to unpack this again, what does Rosenzweig mean when he says not yet? I want to unpack a little bit more, going back to the example that Rashi raised, right? This idea that God is our re'echa, right? God is the one we are in relationship with, just we are in relationship with human beings, which means on some level, the kind of response that we give to God should make sense as the kind of response we might be able to give to our spouse when they come and they're making a demand of us, they're making a request of us, something maybe we don't really feel we want to do or ought to do. As I said before, right, in the rabbinic mindset, the biblical mindset, God is our re'echa, God is our spouse. We are bound to God in the covenant, and the mitzvot emerge from that covenantal relationship. They emerge from the unique nature of that relationship. When God asks us to do something, one has to think about it as no different than if your spouse, your wife or your husband was going to ask you to do something. So here's the example. I want to play this out because I think it's really important. Imagine for a moment your wife or your husband comes up to you and wants you to do something, right? They're making a demand of you. You don't understand, though, what exactly is going on. The request doesn't quite make sense to you, but you feel really strongly that they want you to do it. Like you can tell they really want you to do this thing that they're asking you to do. Like their desire, their demand, it's palpable, it's intense, you can feel it. This isn't like a little thing. They really want this. One could even say that if you hear this from your spouse, that you feel it as a command, right? There's something when your spouse makes that demand of you, you feel it in a very, very strong and intense way. And as Rosenzweig said every mitzvah with God is a command to love God on a certain level, right? And we know that with our spouses too. When they make that real profound demand of us, on some level, what they're asking us to do is to say yes to loving them, right? It's all about it. Behind the demand is this demand for love. Now, the challenge for us when we're put in that position is that saying yes to them under those kind of circumstances where we can't understand it or we don't agree with them or we think it's wrong or we think it's going to be painful, if we say yes to that demand of theirs, it means giving up our own autonomy. And that's something we find very, very difficult to do, right? If we want to try to understand it, like in a way that we could say yes to it, right? One way to look at it, as I said, is to feel one always has the right to say no, right? Like this is maybe the more modern conception of marriage, right? We feel we can say no to our spouse whenever they ask of us because my spouse doesn't control me, right? A marriage is a partnership, we might say. I might be able to say yes in that moment to my wife when she's making this kind of demand, but only if I have a good reason, right? I'll give you one way you could conceive of this, right? You could conceive of it as like, my wife's making this crazy demand of me. I don't want to say yes. This is wrong. I don't want to do this, but I will say yes. Why? Because I know that in the future, when I make my crazy demand of my wife, she'll listen to me, right? And the way this logic can work is essentially one of exchange or quid pro quo. Right? Yeah, I'm married with my wife. I'm stuck with her. She's going to have her craziness. I'm going to say yes, but I'm only going to say yes because I know in the future she's going to have to say yes to me. And this can sort of work when you're trying to like answer somebody's what you perceive to be irrational demands. But if that's the way you conceive of it, that you're only doing it because you're going to get something out of it, there's a problem, right? Which is that eventually what happens when you're saying yes, but the other side isn't saying yes in return. Because the moment you feel, if you think about a marriage as, again, exchange, the moment you're not getting something out of it, then is the moment that you no longer really feel that you need to listen to the other side's demands at all. So you might say, what's the big deal with saying no once in a while, right? Like, why is this such a problem? Doesn't everybody have the right to draw lines with their spouse? Of course, that's true with one spouse, but here's the problem. If you can say no to your wife or your husband whenever they make a request of you that is hard or difficult or doesn't make sense, then are you really in a marriage at all? Because what makes a marriage unique is the way you are bound to your spouse. Because that's what love does. It binds us to the other, and it binds us to them in ways that we can't fully escape. If your wife knows you will say no to her anytime she asks you to do something that you don't want, because you feel you have a right to say no, and that's the end of the story. Well, what this makes clear ultimately to her, and should make clear to you as well, is that you're not really in a marriage anymore. It's really more of like a business arrangement or a business partnership in which each side only signs up to get something from the other side, right? I'll listen to you as long as you listen to me. And again, we all enter into marriage with that perception at times because, like, why wouldn't I? Like, I'm not here to be my wife's slave. Like, of course, I'm going to make them. She's going to make demands. I'm going to make demands. But what we know deep down, and every marriage hits a point where this really becomes, real for us, is that what love really is? Or is love when you feel so bound to your wife or your husband that when they ask you to do things that you don't want to do, part of you still finds a way to say yes because you love them, right? And it's that love that binds you to them no matter what. So to be clear, the point that we love our spouses, and that gives us the ability to say yes to them, even when they make demands of us that we think are unreasonable or unfair or difficult. It doesn't mean that we should say yes to everything that our spouse asks of us, right? Which is often, again, what the Orthodox position says, right? Whatever God demands, you just, you say yes. You say hineni, you say, how high. Because in truth, if I must say yes to whatever my spouse asks of me at all times, then that's not really a marriage either. That's a recipe for abuse, for sacrificing myself in ways that will inevitably damage who I am if I just only have to say yes to her no matter what. This, by the way, isn't a marriage either. If you are in a relationship with another party in which you have to say yes to whatever they demand of you, it's not marriage. It's called slavery, right? And it's clear that God does not want that either, right? The covenantal relationship with God is not slavery. It's not the master makes demands and commands and we just say yes. And how do we know that it's not slavery, that it's something else? It's actually very clear in Hosea. Again, I don't think I brought the pasuk here, the verse, but what the prophet says is that one day the Jewish people will call God Ishi, my husband, and not Ba'ali, my master. That the ideal relationship between God and the Jewish people is not just one of Ba'ali, of master. God's my master, I'm the slave, I just do whatever the master commands me to do. It is ultimately Ishi, my husband, right? It means being in that marital relationship that is based on love, right? Like on a love that binds us to God, and God to us, right? So that's something else. That can't just be yes all the time, right? Because then that's not what marriage is. So where does that leave us? If a Jew can't say yes to everything, because that'd be slavery and self-annihilation, but at the same time, one also recognizes that saying no will break the relationship and turn it into something where it's about me getting what I want, then that is not a relationship that is ultimately founded on love, right? This inextricable connection that binds us to the other. So what kind of answer can we give? If you say yes all the time, it's slavery. And if you say no all the time, there's really no covenant there. So this is where we get to Rosenzweig's answer of not yet. Because not yet is neither yes or no, but ultimately both, right? Not yet is actually carries both of these elements in it. I'll just explain what that means. If my wife asks me to do something and I don't feel I can do it, answering not yet is not a yes. By saying not yet, I am making clear to my wife that I cannot do what she wants. I don't have the ability to do so. And by saying not yet, I'm making clear to her that she's not going to get what she wants, at least not right now. So in a sense, not yet is a no, right? She wants something, I can't give it to her, not yet. But not yet is also not a no, right? It's also a yes, because it makes clear that while I can't do what my wife asks me right now, that when I say not yet, I'm affirming my desire to do what she wants, at least at some point in the future. Right? Not yet is not a cop-out, not in the way Rosenzweig understands it. It means asserting a contradiction, or what they call in philosophy a dialectic. It means asserting the truth of one's autonomy by saying, I simply don't have the ability to do that yet. But it also means that one's autonomy is never final in one's relationship with the one we love. Because to be in a relationship with another person, to love them and to be truly bound to them, means recognizing there are times where we not only have to say yes, but that I want to say yes to what they're demanding of me, even if it's not totally clear right now what that means. This, by the way, has been one of the harder lessons for me in my own marriage. I think it's probably true in most marriages. I have to admit, I'm stubborn. I like things to be done a certain way. I really don't like giving in on my autonomy to do things that my wife asks of me, especially when I can't understand her reasoning, or I don't think she's right, or I think she's like totally wrong. Right? When my wife presents me with those demands in that fashion, there's a part of me that says, "No way am I doing this? You're crazy." But as we all hopefully learn in marriage, love means recognizing that those demands our spouse makes of us, those mitzvot, and they are commandments, are always on some level a call to love them. And if we know that we love them, then we have to be open to answering that demand of theirs, that call of theirs to us. Maybe not right here, right now, but at some point, just not yet. And this is the response I think Rosenzweig suggests when he says that the proper approach for the Baal Tshuva, no, the proper approach for all Jews when it comes to mitzvot, must be not yet, right? And it's not an easy response. God is making all these demands of us, and what we are effectively saying to God at times is not that I'm never going to do this, that this is like unacceptable, this doesn't meet my standard of morality, how dare you make this demand of me? What we have to say to all of the ones that we can't yet do is not yet. So what makes this, I think, this approach difficult is that saying not yet is not just a one-time thing. Right? It's something that we have to keep repeating to ourselves, right? If you can just say it once, like your wife says to you, says like, I want you to do this, Zach, and I say, no, not yet. Like that's not as a one-time answer sufficient, because to say not yet means you have to hold yourself responsible that it can and God willing will happen at some point in the future. To say not yet means you feel the constant pull of the mitzvah, even if you're not able to do them. Right? And the temptation or the danger when we say not yet is that it'll turn into a no. Right? That's what happens to most of us. Right? Take the example of the convert in the Hillel story. He thinks he knows all the Torah. Right? How easy it would be for him now to forget the second part of Hillel's statement. Right? The now go study. Hillel knows that even for the greatest Torah scholar, the meaning of Torah is never fixed. Right? They never can do all the mitzvot. There's always more to be learned. There's always more to be done. The final truth of Torah is always not yet. Right? There's always more. That's what he's trying to tell the convert. I can teach you the Torah on 1 foot, but the ultimate meaning of Torah is not yet. And you have to accept upon yourself that dimension of it. And the same is true when it comes to our spiritual growth in life. Right? We all reach a certain point in our halachic observance, and we say that we're like basically done. Okay, this is as far as I'm going to go. Right? For a while, we saw maybe other mitzvot or other possibilities and said not yet, anticipating, hoping we get to them at some point. But what usually happens after a while is that we reach a point and we just say, okay, we're done. This is as far as I'm going to go. And we basically stop saying not yet. Right? So to say not yet in a meaningfully theological way, it means saying it over and over again. It means saying it each day to all the mitzvot you're not doing. It's not saying it once and then forgetting about them, or saying it once and then slowly letting that not yet become a no, because that's always the temptation. And what's interesting is when you look at Rosenzweig's example about the tefillin, if you remember, Rudy Hallow asked him why he wasn't doing more mitzvot on the day of his wedding. And then later that day, Rosenzweig put on tefillin for the first time. It was that day his not yet became a now, became a yes. But this was only possible for Rosenzweig because he owned a pair of tefillin, right? By owning them, they could serve as a perpetual reminder that the mitzvah was not yet, meaning he had to have the tefillin all this time. Who knows how long Rosenzweig had the tefillin before he finally put them on? If he just said to himself, not yet, someday I'll do the tefillin, but he didn't own them, how could he have really been open to the moment when he would be able to say yes to the tefillin, to the mitzvah tefillin? And then the same is true for all of us. If we're going to say not yet to certain mitzvot, then at the very least, we have to take real action, which could potentially turn that not yet into now, right? It's never just enough to pay lip service to mitzvot and say, I'll get to them one day. You have to feel them calling to you, even when you're not able to do them. And you have to take steps to at least make it possible that someday you will be able to do them. So that's the first challenge of not yet. It's not a mediocre, lukewarm kind of answer. It's not a deflection. It's something that reflects a real sense of commitment to the future of the way you want it to be. And that means you got to stick with it every day. Right? You have to stick with it, and you have to hold open the possibility through your own actions, through your own efforts, that makes clear you feel the call of those mitzvot, right? The tefillin, or the aspects of Shabbos, or whatever it is that you're not yet doing, right? You are holding the door open to the possibility by taking steps actively that might someday make it possible. That's point number one. Point number two, and this is, I think, really very interesting, is that to say not yet is actually risky. And what do I mean by this? In many ways, To say no is much more comfortable, right? If my wife comes to me and she says, Zach, I want you to do this, and I really don't want to do it, I think she's being crazy, and what I really want to do is just say no. No, I'm never going to do that, right? Like no is in some ways the easy answer, because to say not yet means me admitting in that moment that my wife might be right, that she has a right to make this demand of me, and that someday I'm going to say yes to this, right? That it's much easier to say no, because no means never having to say you're wrong, where not yet means you might actually come to realize you were wrong, that you should have done it and you will do it. So this becomes very clear in the Star of Redemption. I'll read this quickly, but I think it's very, very powerful. He says, and this is talking about God's relationship to the human being in the act of revelation. He says, it is the beloved's confession of love that replies to the lover's demand of love. And he's referring to God and the human being. We experience God's love. That is revelation for Rosenzweig. And that experience of God's love demands a mutual response, right? It demands us confessing our love back to God, right? I think I've used this example before, right? When two people fall in love, somebody's got to say, I love you first, right? And in Revelation, God says, I love you to us first. And then the question is, can we say, I love you back to God? That's the confession that Rosenzweig is referring to. That's the ability to say yes to God's demand, to God's that moment of mitzvah. So here's how Rosenzweig understands that, though, our confession of love. He says, and the soul is ashamed of its past self and of not having with its own strength broken the spell whose captive it was. Meaning in the moment when you can say yes to love, something interesting happens. It forces you to look back on every other moment of your life before then. And what you realize is all those moments where you couldn't admit to God's love. And he says, this is the shame that spreads over the beloved's mouth that wants to confess. It must acknowledge its weakness, both past and present, where it would like already to acknowledge its bliss, both present and future. Meaning in the moments when we can finally say yes to the one we love, right? We don't want to look backwards. We want to just look forwards. But in that moment, we can say yes. We can say, I love you back, and we can respond. It also forces us to think differently about where we've been. He says, so the soul is ashamed of confessing its love to God, who calls out to it his commandment of love. For it can acknowledge its love only by acknowledging its weakness and by replying to God's, thou shalt love, I have sinned. Right? So again, using the example with the spouse, when your wife says, I want you to do this, it's so important, you need to do this, right? And as I said, the easy answer would be no. No, I think you're wrong. No, I think you're crazy. That's the end of the story. When you say not yet, that means you're opening to the door to the possibility when you'll say yes. And when you'll say yes, you'll have to look back at those feelings of no and realize that you are wrong. Because when you say yes, it's not a concession. We say yes to our spouse under those conditions. It's not like, oh, I'm finally going to give in to you. That's not what Rosenzweig's talking about here. When you say yes, it's because you can finally say, I love you back. And when you say, I love you back, you realize how horrible you've been all those times you were effectively saying no when you said not yet, right? So to say not yet, as I said, is risky because it means a willingness to be wrong. But when the moment comes and we can finally answer God's call and we can do that mitzvah, we also recognize that our inability to do so in the past was a failure to a certain extent on our part. We were wrong. Saying no is so much easier because it ends the story. Not yet means we have to be open to the possibility that we are going to be wrong. Saying not yet holds open that possibility of the future. And that's what's really, really significant for Rosenzweig, because it means the future is not yet written. If I was to say no, that would be the end of the story. No closes the door on the demand becoming a mitzvah, right? It just says, that's it. I don't want to do this. Never going to happen. And if you say no loudly enough and enough times to your spouse, the message is clear. It conveys the very clear message that I don't want to be in a relationship with them. And at the end of the day, it's the act of saying not yet that allows us to be in a true relationship with God, even if we can't say yes at the moment. Not yet is an answer of love. I love you so much, I want to get there someday, even though I can't get there. I can't be there right now. If we were only to say yes all the time, whether it be to our spouses or to God, that would be slavery. If we said no whenever we wanted, it wouldn't be a marriage. It wouldn't be a brit. It would just be a business arrangement. It would be just about getting what we want out of the partnership, out of the agreement. Saying not yet is what preserves the possibility that when the one we love, when the other makes demands of us, that we have the ability to say yes, at least at some point. And this is always at the heart of love, because love means being bound to the other. It means having the ability to say yes, even when they make demands of us that seem insane or ridiculous or impossible, because only love can make that possible. Love enables us to say yes ultimately to the people we love, even when they make the most impossible demands with us. So I want to conclude by tying this idea of not yet into a larger theological point for Rosenzweig, because I think it helps, again, just see this. This isn't just a practical point. It isn't just a psychological point. There's something much, much bigger at stake here. And that's, for Rosenzweig, not yet defines our relationship to redemption. And as I said before, redemption is everything for Rosenzweig. He calls his book The Star of Redemption. You don't call, whatever you put in the title of your book says something very important about what that book's about. So when Rosenzweig calls his great work The Star of Redemption, it means it's about redemption. That is the central focus. And for Rosenzweig, the Jewish relationship to redemption is fundamentally one of not yet. So we have to understand what that means. So here's the two citations from the Star. I think they're very, very powerful, but again, they always have this poetic philosophical language, and we'll end on these. So Rosenzweig, in this citation, he starts, God and man already are, the world is becoming. So to a certain extent, God and man we're kind of fixed in who we are, in our essence to a certain extent, but the world is becoming. The world is always in this process of change. And as Rosenzweig says here, the world is not yet complete. Right? We know that the world is not yet complete because the world is not yet redeemed. Only redemption will complete fundamentally the process of creation. He says, laughter and tears are still in it. Right? You're only laughing because something in the world doesn't make sense, it doesn't quite fit right, and you're only crying because the world fails to meet the ideals and hopes and dreams that we have for it. And he says, and the tears are not yet wiped away on all the faces. There's suffering, there's pain. That is a world that is not complete. This state of becoming, of incompletion, can only be grasped by seeing the objective relationship to time from another angle. Right? The time, temporality is what makes creation, makes the world incomplete, right? Because time means everything is always changing. It's always in motion. As a matter of fact, the past, the already complete, is there from its beginning to its end, and an account can be given of it. Meaning we can look back at the past and we can tell history. We can see the past in a fixed fashion, right? A happened, B happened, C happened, D happened. For all counting begins from the beginning of the series, right? We can count the years from the past up until today. We can give it a rigidity and a fixedness. But the future can be grasped in its reality. That is to say, as future, only by means of anticipation, right? The past is fixed, but the future is fundamentally open, which means we can only look forward to it, but we don't yet know what it's going to be. So Rosenzweig continues, if one wanted to give an account of the future, one would surely turn it into a frozen past. Meaning, if you think you can say what the future is going to be and its specificity, you are turning the future into the past. We know the past has a fixedness to it. The future does not. The future is open. The future is not yet. That which is future calls for being predicted. It calls us to look towards it, to feel drawn to it. But the future, again, is not yet here. The future is experienced only in the waiting. Something we look to, but do not fully know yet. And then in another section of Rosenzweig, he makes it clear, very clear with the language of not yet. He says, we are seeking an infinite life, and we are finding one that is finite, right? To be a human being in the world is to be finite, and it is to live in a world that is, again, limited, broken, changing constantly. But we want more. We, as human beings being created in the image of God, have the capacity for infinity. We grasp as human beings infinity, even if we don't live it, but that means we aspire to it. The finite life that we are finding is therefore simply the one which is not yet infinite. We have the capacity for more than what the world is, and therefore that is what we search for, even though it is not yet here. The world must become fully alive, right? That's what redemption is. It's completion. It's alive. Instead of several centers of life like raisins in a cake, the world must become fully alive. Right? And we can use here the same parallel to the mitzvot, right? It's not just enough to do some of the mitzvot, like raisins in a cake, right? The whole idea is that we're aspiring, right, for the transformation, the completion of everything, right? That is what redemptive yearning is all about. Existence must be alive through and through, every dimension of it, every dimension of the world, every human being in the world, every aspect of creation, every mitzvah, every halacha, every minhag, right? That's the parallel. That it is not yet so means simply, once again, that the world is not yet finished. So again, what Rosenzweig is arguing here is that the future is unwritten. If we were to say yes, it would be as if redemption was already here. That would be wrong, right? We know that's not the case. And the alternative, that would be imagining that we are already living in utopia, right? If we said yes to redemption, as if it was already here. And again, there have been Jews that have done that throughout history. We've had false messiahs, Jews who thought, okay, redemption is here. Yes, we are there. Everything is complete. You have nothing to worry about. Again, there are Jews who felt this way after the establishment of the state of Israel. There are Jews who still feel this way, that we are there. Redemption is here. But Rosenzweig is pointing out, we're not there yet. The future is unwritten. It's not the case that we can just say yes. But at the same time, we can't say no, because nothing would be more sad and nothing would be more false than to say no. No would mean no, saying no to the possibility of redemption, right? To the call of redemption. Because saying no would mean that the world as it is all it can be. That the way the world is right here, right now, with all of its evil and all of its suffering and all of its brokenness, is all that it can be. And as for Rosenzweig, we recognize the world is incomplete. The world is not yet finished. Creation is not yet finished, which means that possibility of redemption is not here. It's not yes, and it's not never. It's not no. It's ultimately not yet. And that's the same orientation that Rosenzweig is asking us to take to religious life as a whole. What is a Jew supposed to be saying, whether it's to God and to the world and to all the things that we hope and aspire for? It's not yes, we're not already there. It's not no, we can never get there. It's not yet. The world and our religious lives are not yet complete. The world is not yet redeemed, that we hope and pray that we'll get there. And we are not yet doing all the mitzvot, but we believe and we work towards that possibility for the day when we will be able to say yes to God's call for us. I'm happy to open up to questions if anybody has.
One very short comment.